Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Kelly DeVries to discuss the series of medieval English civil wars known as the Wars of the Roses. Dr. DeVries received his Ph.D. in medieval studies from the Center of Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto. He has taught courses on medieval history and warfare and currently teaches at Loyola University in Baltimore, Maryland. He has written countless works, monographs, and articles on the subject of medieval warfare and history, and has appeared on podcasts, television programs, and various media appearances. He himself has a podcast on medievalist.net discussing medieval warfare and battle called Bow and Blade. Dr. DeVries, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, this is um, interesting now that we've got to include podcasts at the end because I've done media a lot. I was just in fact in LA to do a new one on Dark Marvels, a History Channel show called Bad Technology. You know, the guillotine and all these other things. So we'll see how that comes out. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So, if I can ask a very broad and general question, what is the War of the Roses? Was it a single set of wars, or is it a collection of different civil wars that happen across a period of time? How best would you describe it?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely a series of wars, and often referred to as Wars of the Roses. But to me, it also can be defined as kind of the last gasp, the last English gasp in what is the Hundred Years' War. I think the Hundred Years' War is a lot of wars, and we get even though Wars of the Roses technically will begin in at least ideology before the English have lost the Hundred Years' War. Both England and France, as the main Hundred Years' War fighters, will have their own civil wars. They'll have their own vying for power among the nobles who think that maybe the king shouldn't have as much power as he's acquired over the time that they've been fighting. I mean, it is of necessity when somebody fights a pre-modern war that the central authority, the king, in both these cases, will have extraordinary abilities to do things without parliament or some form of council uh, cutting those policies down. And so it's because you need to be able to raise troops, you need to be able to respond to attacks and campaigns, you need to be able to put extraordinary measures in place to feed people that whose crops might be down and so forth. And so both the English king and the French king come out of the Hundred Years' War really strong. And these in this in both sides. So on the French side, for example, Louis the XI is going to come out, and Louis the XI is going to be have to fight a war of the public weal against some of his nobles. It'll be over before the Wars of the Roses, but it's essentially at the exact same time. And Charles the Bold has been involved in the Hundred Years' War. Well, his father's been involved in the Hundred Years' War. Now he's going to challenge the French king, and we get on England the situation where Richard of York comes back after 1450, after being a dreadful general, by the way, in the in the Hundred Years' War. I mean, I don't care what side you're on. Richard is kind of coming back, saying, let me disrupt this. Let me take all this blame and put it on the king." When in fact he's been the man in France, and he's just lost Normandy. So he's dreadful general, and he decides to come back and say, "Oh, this is the way I'll move it. It wasn't me; it was the guy who was in charge of me that did this." And so that's where the extension comes out in England. But I do find it interesting. We wanted to have everything cut and dry in 1453. All right, England lost. There goes Gascony. It's the last gasp, except for Calais, of course. But it's the last gasp. War's done. England lost. French win. Now let's go and have peace. And they don't. Neither side has peace.
Right. I think that it makes a lot of sense to view the War of the Roses as kind of an outgrowth of the Hundred Years' War, and that the position that Richard of York finds himself in, he probably wouldn't have warred against the king the way he did had things gone differently in his campaigns in France. What would you
I
say to
think
that?
there'd be no question that that's the case. Yeah. He needs to come back and reestablish his own power base. He's got his wealth, and we have to remember too, he may be Duke of York, but he doesn't go. He's not in York. York's a Lancastrian holding, as a royal city and everything. So Richard may have the title of Duke of York, but that's just the next one down. It's kind of a meager title that doesn't really give us any geographical location of where his lands are. He's mostly he's mostly a power broker in the south. He has the Warwick and the Nevilles in the north, or I'm sorry, the Nevilles and the Percys in the north. They're very wealthy. They've stayed out of the French conflict as much as they could, and then the king, and a whole bunch of other nobles, and really they're coming back after defeat, and after the great heroes of the last 200 years, Henry V and Edward III. It's a bad legacy to come back saying, "Oops, we even lost Gascony," which will happen in 3 years after Richard comes back. He comes back around 18 or around 1450 after, but he was in charge of Normandy and lost it. So in 1450.
And if I can maybe also ask, with respect to the War of the Roses, how unprecedented would you say were the struggles for power that occurred at this time? I mean, I ask this question just because questions of succession, I don't think were ever this
Mm-hmm.
contentious in England. Like even when Edward II was deposed, it was never in dispute who his successor would be. But in the War of the Roses, there was such a vie for power among the different strands, all descended from
Yeah.
Edward III, that people couldn't make heads or tails of who was supposed to be king.
Well, it wasn't unprecedented. I mean, England had this is by my count the fourth civil war in medieval England since William the Conqueror. I mean, we could say that inheritance crisis may have started it all out, but we have to remember that Stephen and Matilda, of course, that big war in the 12th century, and then we get the war, but with Simon de Montfort and trying to fight against Henry III and Edward I, his son, come to power in that way. He recognizes power, and then Henry IV overthrows Richard II. So there's a third inheritance battle, and now we're finally on the fourth one. But it's also not unprecedented because the French are having one as well at the same time, and the Burgundians are actually having one right after Charles the Bold dies at the Battle of Nancy, because Mary will fall off a horse in not too many years afterwards, and so Louis the Ninth or Louis the 11th tries to take the Low Countries holdings back, and does take Artois out from the Burgundian, and of course the Germans and Italian secession wars they're all over the place, especially in Germany. uh, Probably the most with it. We got to remember the Ottomans are also way over on the side at this exact moment, and the only time Europe breathes a sigh of relief is when a sultan dies, because there's going to be a war of inheritance coming. So it's not unprecedented for this period. I mean, I've often thought, could I write the 15th century as a war of as inheritance wars and wars of rebellion, and not even mention not even mention kings and things like that. Could I just work around it and just talk about the people who are revolting against whom? I I still play. I still have got a bastardized version, computer version of Kingmaker, which I don't know whether you know the game Kingmaker. When I was a kid, I used to play it. It came out of Avalon Hill, United States, and it has an interpretation of Wars Roses. Basically, says the royals have no are nothing. It's all the nobles, which is simply an interpretation that had come out around that time, around the 1970s, 1960s. It was a fun game, and then it became a computer game early on. But you can still play it. I will still enjoy it every once in a while. And you're looking, the last guy or that wins the game is the one who has not all the royals, but has one royal. So if he has more than one, he has to keep cutting off heads, and uh, um, and it's always fun because there's a loose person in that Beaufort who could become the king, but he won't in history. But he could because he's the only one who has ties to the royal lines at that point in time. So Henry Tudor has no ties. I mean, he has really no claim. He's going to win the whole thing. So it's so there's no precedent. Wars of the Roses is just one more of these civil wars. It just happens to have a great name. And I mean, the rest of them are like the Anglo or the Franco-Burgundian War. There's War of the Public Weal is pretty good there. But War of the Roses has that kind of, well, first of all, it's dealing with very beautiful flowers, and whenever you can couch the warfare of this period, which is very violent, especially this war, extremely violent. Lots and lots of deaths, whereas wars, even in France, don't have that many deaths. I mean, ransom of leaders is still the most frequent end of a war is that there are a whole bunch of prisoners that are going to be taken off to the side and ransomed. But Wars of the Roses, no, they're just getting their head lopped off if they're captured. So it's very, very violent. So I always enjoyed the image of these beautiful flowers, and then red and white beautiful flowers, and that then is symbolizing what is England's bloodiest civil war. I think it needs to be more bloody than the one that'll come up in the 17th century. So
there,
um,
there's almost like a romanticization of the War of the Roses, and I think that a lot of the sort of popular presentation that we get from chroniclers and historians is that they're trying really really hard to legitimize the Lancastrian claim. Like they're trying very hard to make York uh, corrupt. Richard III, Shakespeare's your plays. They really want to make it look like York's like this terrible usurping house, and that this Henry Tudor, who's kind of a random noble who has a very scant line to the question of succession. He's really the person who unites the two houses
yeah,
together.
right. It is. I mean, it's a time when if you're looking at it, only Edward IV has any real viability as a king. Henry VI is terrible. Richard III is, in 3 years becomes the demon that we either want to make him be or not. But he is, we're either making him a semi demon or a real big demon in whatever way we want to deal with it. And then Henry VII is terrible and gives us Henry VIII, gives us the whole Tudors, which is probably the most dysfunctional royal family. It makes all the medieval royal families seem completely normal, kind of like the modern royal in comparison to what to that big ball of evil that is Henry VIII. It is kind of interesting to look at the Wars of the Roses in this way and recognize, as precisely as you say, that we the flowers are beautiful, and it's kind of trying to romanticize it, maybe, or trying to, I don't know, romanticize it, trying just to make it seem a lot less a lot less violent than it is. Let's put it that way. I mean, I think it's kind of funny. There's still kind of embers below this fire that's burned out for a long time, because I have friends who live in Yorkshire, and He's from Leeds, Yorkshire, Leeds area, Yorkshire, and she's from Lancaster area over on his side. But she makes the better Yorkshire pudding. So this is that's kind of the wars of the roses over who makes the best Yorkshire pudding out of the two in the couple. And it's just okay. Yeah, I see the wars of the roses. I'll bring out a little flag, put it on both sides, white and red rose. So there are it's remembered probably more in history than it has a right to be, because the Hundred Years' War is so much more important for England, than the Wars of the Roses. So much longer and so much more, so much bigger, uh, bigger goals and bigger outcomes than the Wars of the Roses. But it's the one that everybody wants to remember. So whoever named it, way back when, whoever kind of coined this phrase, it's the Wars of the Roses, not the Lancastrian Yorkist War of Succession, then you might somebody should give the best war title.
So I figured before we dive right into Richard of York and his campaigns, I figured we could maybe sort of set the stage of what maybe leads up to all of this, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
I figured maybe we could first discuss how it kind of all sort of begins. I guess we would say the Hundred Years' War is a very very big factor, but another big factor is King Edward III and his children.
Yeah.
Um, who was King Edward III? What kind of king was he, and how would you describe maybe his rule and legacy?
Well, I think it's Edward III. I mean, he's got the longest. Well, Henry III had the longest reign, but Edward III comes on the throne in 1327, and he's going to be there until 1377. 50-year reign in the Middle Ages is long by any stretch. It's only the fact that King John died that early that Henry III is on the throne for so long. And Edward III, because of his lineage, because he is the son of the son of Edward II on the one side, but the son of Philip of Isabel of France on the other. He is actually the direct descendant of both thrones that are going to. Well, he forces the throne with the exile and death of his father. He forces the English throne open in 1327, but in 1328 he is the closest to the French throne by lineage. In fact, they have to get out that old, Salic law and dust it off, both to get him out of the way and get Charles of Navarre out of the way, because both of them have a better claim on the throne than Philip VI does. And so they come up and say, well, through you can't reign through, you can't get the reign through the woman. Well, Isabel isn't going to believe that, nor is Rich, or Edward. And so, almost immediately after 1327, he starts, well, after the death of Charles IV in 1328, he starts, saying basically, oh, here, I'm the king of both. I mean, his coat of arms was the fleur de lis and the lion. I mean, there was no question. And that's what he starts, that's his pretense for invasion, in 1337. One of the things um, it's always taught when I teach this to the students, they say, well, why does it take 10 years? I said, well, he's got the Scots. He's got to deal with the Scots, and he's also got to deal with his own nobles because he's usurped his father's throne. So he's around for 10 years. But already, in 1328, the mayor of Bruges is at war with the Fleming, or the Count of Flanders. County of Flanders is at war with the French king, and Bruges is trying to lead the way. So the mayor of Bruges sends people over to Edward the third and say, come, you're close. We don't like Charles. We think that Charles IV is terrible. So why don't you come over and be king? And then when Charles dies, they resend these diplomats to Edward, or they're still there. I can't trace whether they've returned or not, but they again offer the throne to Edward. So he's getting it from all sides. No, his mother's pushing him to take the French throne. he knows that he is closest. I mean, to that, he's the only grandson of well, he and Charles Nevers are the only grandsons of Edward of I'm sorry, Philip the Fair, and so he says, hey, you know, everybody's kind of thinking I should be there, and then except for the people who actually choose the king over in France. They then go back up the genealogy and over across to Philip of Valois. But so it's so Edward is a guy who takes advantage of his situation and probably has an ego big enough to suggest that he can go and punch the biggest guy in the playground, which is France, and say, "All right, I'm going to go to war with you." In many ways, now it's funny because, of course, we have John Sumption just wrote a little book. Well, just wrote a couple 3 years ago, wrote a little book for the Penguin series on Edward the Third, and he said, Edward's really a crappy king, and he goes on to it, and I guess he can say that. I was talking to some who were thinking on the other direction, and they weren't completely pleased with what Jonathan had said, but everything he said was accurate if looked at from another view other than an English royalist view. And then, but if you're looking at an English royalist view, Edward comes off pretty strong, at least until 1360. He comes off very strong until 1360, but especially his victorious campaigns in 1340, defeating the French navy at Slough, perhaps not getting Tournai, then getting involved in the war in Brittany, having his the support his support, having the count there become the one who he supports, finding a proxy war there. Then this huge campaign in 1346, the capture of Calais at the end of the Battle of Casey, capture Calais, and then Black Death. Well, we got to remember that kind of comes in, but then his son Edward the Black Prince. Winning at Poitiers and capturing the French king. So that by 1460, the French king has signed over the lands that Edward believed were his. He doesn't have them all, but he's been assigned that. And there's the question about ransom he's willing to pay. Interestingly, he does not transfer the power of the king. Edward can now call himself all he wants, the King of France, but he's had the King of France in his home in London, and he's got to recognize that man as the King of France if he's going to get the ransom and get the lands. So the title goes away, but he still calls himself King of France. But so all during that, and after 1460, things go a little bit to the south for him. He actually tried. I mean, the peace treaties in the Hundred Years' War broken as fast as they are made, and Treaty of Brittany in 1360 really does. Again, I mean, the proxy war goes to Spain for a few years, and then it comes back, and Black Prince continues to fight. But Charles V, at that point, King of France, is now starting to win back. So by the death of Edward III, he really had not a lot of power in France, except Calais and Gascony still. So it's a mixed bag. Do we look at that and say, okay, that makes him really great? He wins at Crécy, wins Calais. He's great in the conquest. It's hard not to say that. It gets the French king, captures the French king, it promises ransom, which never gets paid, and but then kind of dies, having not really established much more than he had in the first in 1340. Really, Calais is different, perhaps the only addition.
And another thing that is sort of difficult with the sort of remaining years of Edward III's reign is that the Prince of Wales, Edward the Black Prince, dies, and you know
Yes.
he imparts a lot of power onto his all of his children, but it was never a question of who would succeed him. It was going to be the Prince of Wales. But when he died, it sort of left something of a power vacuum, and the crown would have passed to Edward's son, but it was still kind of
Yeah.
awkward because I don't remember how old
Oh,
Edward
the
II was.
Black Princes. The Black Princes. I mean, He leaves a teenager, Richard, at that point. And Black Princes. I've always thought of Black Prince as being the worst absentee father, because you know his Richard lives in. I mean, he grows up, but in France, and he's surrounded by all these the women who are racing him there. All the men are over fighting. All the important men are fighting. John of God doesn't stick around in London much, and Edward's Black Prince, his capital is at Bordeaux. I mean, it doesn't even consider London as a place to go much. So he is the worst absentee father, but he is next in line. The fact that he predeceases Edward III, that's a really interesting problem that comes about, because there's no question that Edward the Black Prince in Edward III's mind is the successor, and we can argue, and I think the evidence is fairly strong that Edward III did not, you know, chastises Edward the Black Prince at the Battle of Crecy. He gets captured. Edward Black Prince gets captured, and so forth. At the end of the battle, there's none of this Froissart myth that, oh well, you won your spurs and everything. He actually gets chewed out for taking his men out too long. But he's 16. Black Prince is 16 at Crecy. So he's got to be taught these things. Edward takes him well in hand. He's got lots of spares behind, but Edward the Black Prince, he thinks all the way through, is going to succeed him. You've got to remember, in 1375, Edward III has had a stroke and is not in great shape. So at that point, we've got a king who has a stroke and is really physically and mentally limited to still be king. But Edward the Black Prince is in the is disease filled. That's the thing that's going to take him. And it's only a fluke that he dies 1376 and then Edward III in 1377. But there's no question, if Edward the Black Prince had not had, if it had been the other way around, Edward the Third and Edward Black Prince somehow becomes Edward the Fourth, Richard II is going to rule. But he is only a teenager, and I mean, the the others of Edward's sons, especially John of God, thinks that he would make a better king. There's no question. He can't legitimately. There's no divine right to rule in England, but he can't legitimately take England either. So he kind of has, conspires with his son Henry Bolingbroke, to the point where Henry Bolingbroke has to leave England for a while. But then Richard II becomes the worst king that he could have been. It is interesting. There should never be another Richard king. It should end at three, because Richard Lionheart is loved by, and I don't understand why, but he was a terrible king. Richard Lionheart, especially, even though he was only king in England like 18 months, he was dreadful wherever else he went. He doesn't win Jerusalem. He loses all his lands in France. He gets killed by a man described as a cook. I mean, so Richard. I really find the fondness of Richard the First to be a bit exaggerated, but the Richard II and Richard III, at that point, you just stop calling him. It's like, don't ever have a Henry IX. Don't have a John II. You know, don't have a William V. All of those things. I'm not entirely certain that Charles III is a good one to have either, because either
Right.
Charles II or bad. But yeah, so Richard II he is the only man who can take the job at that point. He can't abdicate. There's nothing in any English, well, there's no English constitution, but there's no precedent for him to abdicate.
Right.
So he sticks around. Yeah. But I mean, everything goes, it goes, to hell in a handbasket for Richard because he gets handed this thing in 1377. By the way, you're still, you still have this war going on in France, despite the fact that you're losing. One of the things that provokes the Bishop of Norwich's campaign over there in 1383 is, well, we just got to go back. We've not been in France for a while. Well, you've been fighting the peasants in your own country. Now you're going to go have this crusade and you're going to fight against the wrong people. You're going to fight against the people who actually support the same pope you do. That's, Bishop of Norwich might want to have checked that before going against the Flemings, that they did in fact support the same pope he did, Urban, and the Clementine French on the other side he doesn't engage with. So there's a whole bunch of miscues and so forth, and Richard the Second, I think he's just not the right man for the job, but he's the only man for the job.
I very much like what you said about how the Richards of the English monarchy are either overrated or just terrible terrible kings. Especially with Richard, the fact that he just gets like unceremoniously like picked off in this random castle by a kid. It's like this guy fought like in many crusades. Like why? This is a very like underwhelming way to go out. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean he wasn't a particularly great crusade leader either, because I one of these early in my career I wrote a book for or wrote part of a book on the battles of the Crusades, where I said that Richard had lost the Third Crusade and he had lost the Third Crusade and that he had committed a war crime by killing all the prisoners, men and women, outside of the of Acre after he'd taken it. And I got this 12-page single-spaced letter from somebody in England saying, I've never written to anybody before, but the first 5 pages were why Richard had not lost the Third Crusade, and the last 7 pages on why it was not a war crime to kill the hostages after. I thought, okay, that's kind of fitting. We'll just disagree on this one because yes, it is a war crime to kill innocent, women and men, women, children, as Richard did. But even more, he goes over to Jerusalem, doesn't get it. That's a loss to me.
Right.
I mean, Saladin lets him see it from above, and Saladin keeps his army between Richard and the city, recognizing Richard can't get reinforcements and he can't. So it isn't. Yeah, even trying to give him this idea that he was a great general. He was actually. I still remember Stephen Runciman saying, Richard was a terrible, terrible father, terrible husband, terrible. Goes through this whole list of things. He says, but very good warrior. And I go, yeah, he wasn't actually that good there either.
Right.
Yeah.
And with respect to Richard II, you know, a very terrible king. I was just reading, in fact, this one article on how William Langland's book, Writings Pierce Plowman, he has like a couple jabs against
Oh yeah.
Richard there, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
that's entertaining. But at the same time, though, he's kind of dealt kind of a bad hand. Like England is really just all of Europe is still dealing with the effects or after effects of the plague. There's like crises with Parliament. There's the peasant revolts, and
Peasant
he's
Revolt, yeah. And idea that we identify the Peasant Revolt of 1381, even outside, if you're studying revolts, as French and Italian scholars often do, the 1381 Peasant Revolt stands out on its own as the only time that the peasants really get kind of close to the king.
right.
Even the German revolts of 1525 27 are not, they don't get anywhere near a basis of power. This and yeah, you've got the peasants of England showing up in London. I mean that just so. I think Richard II. You see that wonderful portrait that hangs in Westminster now, and he looks just like a boy. He looks like just like this boy that thrown into this role, all of a sudden, he kind of reminds me of somebody who wants to probably sit in a library for a little bit and just read, or play on the internet, if there was the medieval internet, whatever it was, and not be the king, let alone be a king when when there's a war going on, technically still. There's, not been no, they've had the Treaty of Paris will come along and it will end the war. And so technically he doesn't have to be involved in it, but everybody expects him to be his father and his grandfather as far as a war leader is concerned. And John of Gaunt sees himself that way too. So John, even though John is dreadful, he goes down to, he supports the wrong Portuguese king. He thinks that John wants to be Castilian king of Castile and all sorts of things, and of course he never is very good. I think John of Gaunt's best, other than producing Henry Bolingbroke, whose grandson, and thus produces grandson Henry V. But the other thing is that Henry the Navigator, the guy who goes down the coast of Africa, he's Edward or John of Gaunt's grandson as well. So we have or we have some real interesting individuals who come out of the Edward the Third lineage, because he and Philip of Hainaut produce a lot of children. Um, Edward the Black Prince only has one, and Henry Bolingbroke is only going to have one male, and so this is going to be easier in the long run coming down. John of Gaunt's only having Henry Bolingbroke, so it's we get to a point where poor Richard is like, and I do think of him in this way. I think he's just out of his depth on everything, and it doesn't help then to have your uncle saying, on the side in any drinking house in London, pretty much saying, "Yeah, well, it'd make a better king."
Right, right, right. And eventually, I mean, that does become a point of contention, that John of Gaunt's son Henry Bolingbroke does contest the claim
Yes.
of the throne, and eventually he does become uh, king of England.
Yeah, and I mean it's a sad situation too that Richard ends the way he does. It's I mean, Shakespeare's historical plays cover all these people. They will cover all these people, and many of them are great. I think Henry V may be the greatest, but the most tragic is Richard II. The fact is he's going off to Pontefract Castle, and there, to be starved to death, just to be forgotten and starved to death, which may also have happened to Edward II by his own son too. Maybe that's the only way get rid of an English king. The Tudors bring the beheading along with them, and I'm sure they're a certain lengthy. Somebody saying, we could have done that with Richard II. Just
Right,
beheaded him. Why starve him to death
right,
in a dungeon in a castle in the middle of England?
right. And although I've also heard like very, very like almost fantastic accounts of how Edward II went down, like crazy, like torturous ways, and how he like his innards were like dissolved with like a
Yeah,
fiery poker. And it's like, did this actually happen? Like, I feel like that's a really
yeah.
hard thing to cover up, a way to kill
Well, I mean,
someone.
and Edward II gets these, the anti homosexual kind of tendencies thrown at him. Richard, there isn't much of it. I mean, John of Gaunt or Bolingbroke has taken him up to Pontefract, which is the seat of Thomas of Lancaster's power. And when Thomas of Lancaster, he was beheaded up on a hill right out of the castle. So there's lots of memories of this is where we store people who we think, John of Gaunt will become Duke of Lancaster, so Pontefract's his castle and Henry Bolingbroke's castle, and so they get stuffed there, and it's I mean, nice place to be in England, but not the easiest place to run out to a McDonald's or anything. When you're sitting there as king, there's nothing much you could do. But I think that's just such an ignominy. Um, when the Ottomans overthrow, or whether a succession crisis, everybody loses their head. They're fine to get people out of the way. They'll just lop off a head or two. And that's technically what pretty much anybody else does, but or they die in battle. But the English have this 14th and 15th century, well, 14th because Richard dies in 1399. This kind of love of just sending them off and forgetting them and letting them shrivel down to nothing. And I think, ooh, it's not just the starvation, which would be terrible to die from in this period of time, but also this kind of just being forgotten.
Right.
You know, it's not. It's yeah. It's just. It's not. And I don't know why. I mean, twice in the same century that this is where kings end up, as being starved to death unless this wild poker up the ass
Right.
in Edward II is true. I doubt it, but they seem just to have been forgotten,
Right.
and that's got to be terrible. I was being king one day and then just forgotten, stuck
Yeah.
out. And everybody forgets you to, enough that you don't even get fed.
Right. I mean, it's crazy. You go from being on top, just of the wheel of fortune, and
Yeah,
then you get spun down. I just had John Marenbon. He's a professor of medieval philosophy, and we were talking about Boethius and how this idea of like the wheel, how
mm,
people come up in power and
yeah.
people go down in power, and it's like that is such a great symbol for how to describe the War of the
It
Roses.
really is. Although I did think I actually used this on a phrase on Owen Glendower, for Owen Glendower, but I said, Owen's wheel not only turned, it broke. And I think in Richard's case, it not only turned, it completely obliterated. He fell right off the bottom. Uh, but yes, no question. I mean, the wheel of the Boethius's wheel is going to hit all of these kings. Um, and we get Bolingbroke on the throne during his reign. There's a group of Frenchmen that come and sit outside of Hereford for like a whole year, with no contention. The French just launch something over there and think they're going to see, what I don't think they have any intention to have this small group of Frenchmen take over England, but Henry doesn't even rise up to go kick him out of Wales. So I mean, Henry the Fourth gets a lot of credit. Again, this is probably Shakespeare that gives him more credit than anything. He gets a lot of credit for two things. One is for overthrowing Richard. The other thing is for dying so Henry can go do, that manly war stuff again
Right.
in France.
Well, if I could maybe then follow up with that, how would you best characterize the reign of Henry Bolingbroke, Henry the Fourth of England? Was his rule as a monarch more stable than his predecessor? Was his claim contested? Was he
Oh, it was,
successful?
yeah, it was contested. I mean, Bolingbroke probably fights more battles than, I mean, when Edward III takes over from Edward II, there's no contentions except for the Scots, but they're contentious by definition at this point period of time. When Henry IV takes over, I mean, he fights the Battle of Shrewsbury against mostly English, got Owen Glendower on the side. He's not there at the battle, but that's Percy. That's Hotspur. Henry Percy, who's with using the family money to try to overthrow the king in that battle. That's where Henry V takes the arrow to the head. That has this excruciating but very successful removal of it. And that battle is such a near loss for Henry. If the Henry V with an arrow in his head doesn't turn his forces to relieve Henry IV, then we've got another very short succession, and Henry Percy becomes the next king. So it's Henry IV has, and there's two or three other small revolts. I mean, he's only on the throne for 13 years. We can't really suggest that he had a lot of time to do things, and most of it just because of the ruthlessness of overthrowing Richard II. He's got a time. Henry's got to pacify the kingdom himself first. He's got to get everybody on side, and it's probably his best move in the last major rebellion, which is Owen Glendower's, is just to leave him alone, just to make him irrelevant, which is essentially what he does. So England are, couldn't go around telling everybody in Wales, oh, well, I'm the king and whatever. But Henry just doesn't. At a certain moment in time, it becomes Henry's wise move. Just say, fine, you're irrelevant. We just won't even care about you. And Henry, it gets so far that Henry V will go to France rather than Wales. So I would have to. You'd have to say that Henry IV is an effective king, putting down the rebellion, stabilizing the monarchy, everything, and also recognizing his limits, which Henry V won't. And that, if you think about it, there's no Wars of the Roses without Henry IV. It's really start that point because the Lancasters have come into power by usurping the throne from the king. Then Henry V goes off on this harebrained scheme to walk across the north of France, and with troops that are so few that you know, and I mean, every once in a while you have to wonder if, because we know where that arrow went into, and it must have hit the brain a bit, and you kind of wonder his whole personality seems to change.
Right.
But he then becomes this firebrand. Well, it's the craziest move in the world. He should not have won at Agincourt. There's no way in the world that man should have won at Agincourt, and it is because of him that they win.
Right.
Him and the soldiers he leads. It's always the men. We want no the longbow. No, the longbow doesn't do anything unless somebody's pulling it, and it doesn't do anything unless that group of people who are pulling it are also being led to do what they did. And the Battle of Agincourt is a brilliant victory. But it should never have been. That whole campaign should have been snuffed out. There's
Right.
no way. And so Henry V comes back, having and and then going on the 1417 20 to 23, really, to his death, and captures all that parts of France completely. And he couldn't have done it without John the Fearless from the beginning of it by any stretch of the imagination. Having the Burgundians hate the French equally as much, if not more, than the English,
Right.
gives a strong alliance there. But um, if Henry V doesn't do what he does in France, and then also doesn't die when he does outside of Meaux in 1423, and what we have, he now turns it over. It's the same situation as the Richard the Second. We can't really call Henry an absentee father because that would only be for the last 3 months, 3 months that Henry the Sixth was around when Henry the Fifth was.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, he was an absentee father at the birth, but that beyond that, he dies so quickly. So you've got an infant on so John of Gaunt throwing Bolingbroke into the mix early on, and then Bolingbroke taking over for Richard, giving it to Henry V. By the time we've gotten to Henry VI, they've duplicated the situation, even made it worse with
Right.
an even younger child in the role of King of England, on top of the fact that it changes the whole Treaty of Troy, which is supposed to be given to Henry V at the death of Charles VI, but Charles VI dies after the Henry V.
Right. Right.
And
But
so, there's and all the Anglo-Burgundians, and well, the English especially, but even the Burgundians now felt the good, are willing to say Henry VI is still the king of France because we're going to abide by the Treaty of Troy. Except they've got the problem with the ones that the Burgundians have been fighting against, the
right.
Armagnacs or south of Loire, who have the last son, Charles
The
VII,
Dauphin. Yeah.
of the French throne. And Henry VI being a baby, he can't do anything,
Right.
even
It's like,
even
what
though
this
they
kid
bring
gonna
him
do?
over
Right.
early. Yeah. And then the fluke of having Joan of Arc
Yes.
come in, it's like, if somebody had written this as a sci-fi novel, we'd think it was preposterous. We absolutely would. What? A farm woman comes out and inspires the French army to get Charles up to be crowned in Reims when Henry VI is still too young to try to do that.
Right.
So it's so many different things that happen. If if you were real cynical, I'm often cynical about the British elevation of certain medieval royals. Elevation. I mean, England does become part of Europe, but not until really the Hundred Years' War. But and the English have no problem elevating their own history. Americans do as well, and
Right.
but you come back to it and you go, if Henry V doesn't do what he does, then first of all, England still has Gascony.
Hmm.
So they still have the Gascon wines, and that's the second leading economic producer for England after wool. They still have their connections with the Flemings, and they still have the wool connections. They just don't have parts of England, parts of France that Henry V took, and they've got a king who's staying. Henry V stays at home and probably has nobody contending against him. Probably doesn't get the dysentery that's going to kill him, because why would he if he's just staying at home? Um, but he doesn't. And so then we get the result is Henry VI, who's as weak, if not weaker, than Richard II was.
Right. I mean, if I can then ask, I mean, in your estimation, how would you compare Henry the sixth reign with Henry the fifth? I've always I remember listening to a talk, and I remember the speaker giving quip how, like, in comparison, everyone loves Henry the fifth for his campaigns and success at
Yeah,
Agincourt, and
yeah,
then Henry the Sixth is just this disappointment. He can pretty much loses everything in France except Calais towards the end of his reign, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken.
yeah. No, well, yeah, Calais will stay until Mary, who's another great king, our queen of England next century. She'll lose Calais too, but the loss of Gascony is far more important than the loss of Normandy or the loss of Calais will be in 5058. So it's I don't think that Henry the Sixth again is the wrong place, the wrong time. He's not he's not particularly old when he does take over the throne. I mean, I'm not particularly old. I mean, he's a baby when he takes over the throne. But even when he gets into into dealings with a kingdom that is losing the war after, make no mistake, after 1435, once the Burgundians pull out, and they will go besiege Calais for a few months, but then Philip pulls them completely out of the war. The Burgundians no longer will ever take part in the war,
Hmm.
in the Hundred Years' War, and from then on, the English have gas; they can hang on to its, and the fact that the war will continue for another 20 some odd years, or not quite 20 years, 18 years, is good on one hand, but also is really the death knell of English forces there. And what's the king doing about it? I mean, he sends his cousin Richard Duke of York over. He's terrible. He can't hold on to Normandy.
Right.
Uh, and then Gascony, you send a 70-year-old man and won't wear his armor on the battlefield of Cassillon, and then far too troops to hang on to Bordeaux, or to fight a battle at Cassillon. So it's there's no question that the 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 after the Burgundians pull out of the agreement with England, out of the allegiance with England, England doesn't have a lot of time left.
Right.
Um, and so then the focus comes back to England when Richard returns in 1450, just having lost the the Normandy. The Jack Cade rebellion is happening. Was another peasants' revolt. So, and Richard almost immediately starts calling himself the rightful king of England.
Yeah, that's an interesting claim that Richard makes because if we go back to Henry the third and all of his children, uh, if I remember correctly, Richard of York is descended from the second son of it's Lionel of Antwerp, I think is his name, whereas John of Gaunt's line is the third in line, but
Yeah,
it's the matrilineal line.
yeah,
It's from his mother that he gets that, and I think that's why he styles himself as, oh, I'm the Plantagenet. I'm from the house of Plantagenet. Like, he's harkening back to how Henry II, his claim was to Matilda, his
yeah,
mother's line.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It. I mean, the Edward the Third sons, yes, and curiously all called because John of Gaunt is John of Ghent. He was born in Ghent. Lionel was born in Antwerp because Philippa was there. Philip is from Hainaut, but Antwerp was in Brabant and Ghent in Flanders, and they're only born there because that's where Edward's campaigning. So at a certain moment, Philippa can't be moved, and she has to give birth. She must have been a very strong, powerful woman to have and then to raise these kids essentially without a father,
right.
because Edward the Third does not come back, and then when he does, he's not doing well. He's ailing. Um, so yeah, Richard doesn't have a large claim on the throne. The only reason that John of Gaunt's lineage has usurped the throne from the Black Prince's lineage is that they could.
Right.
That's it. And so uh, it's more by Richard coming back and saying, well, geez, I'm surprised, I'm shocked that a genealogy chart in my bedroom shows that I should be king, not Henry VI. Um, you know, which also then is in part him saying it is also then suggesting that Henry V and Henry IV are should equally not have been king.
Mm,
So he's condemning. I still think, deep down inside, unfortunately, you want to find a smoking gun document where, Richard comes back and says, well, how am I going to prove I'm not a loser?
right.
How am I going to prove it? Oh, I'm going to prove that I'm the rightful king. Well, in fact, the only one who's won is one of the kings you're now saying is rightful,
Right.
and not Henry VI, it's Henry V and Henry IV too. So it's Richard is doing a lot to try to erase the memories of his own losses in France, and by saying, oh, geez, look at this, I found out I'm really supposed to be the king here.
Right. And if I understand correctly, Henry VI around this time, he wasn't a very popular king. I mean, because of his less than discreet diplomatic relations with France, his marriage to Margaret of Anjou, and at this point in time, did he have mental health problems, or does his breakdown come later on in his reign? I've
No,
heard.
well, I mean, he breaks down a bit. I mean, I think his mental problems are exaggerated. Certainly not like Charles VI in France, where he's partially the rubber throne room for much of his time. Then whenever he gets lucid, they try to get everything done. And it's one of the things. Had Charles been more lucid, he wouldn't have had or he wouldn't have had Louis of Orleans off with the Queen, and he wouldn't have had John of Fairless then murder the cousin, then murder one of the brothers of the king. So I mean, Henry VI has none of that. Partly he has no other siblings, so that isn't a real issue. Although his mother will produce some, obviously, especially once she gets married to. No, I'm thinking I'm off a bit. Well, Catherine of Valois, she gets remarried, then she'll marry Tudor. So that's where the other lineage comes from. But yeah, Henry VI, I don't ever see the Henry VI as being an effective king, but he was a good king.
Okay,
Yeah, he just wasn't a war king,
gotcha.
and in part that's because he isn't. he can't be involved in the war in his early reign because of his youth. And so he has to have, you know, people over him, Catherine for a long time, Richard at parts of time when he is younger. So he doesn't, and then when he is able to take over he hits the majority. He has no inclination to go fight these wars in France, or not a great inclination. He personally won't go. I mean, you think about the effective kings over there, and putting Black Prince in there too. Edward III and Black Prince, Henry V, they're all in France. They're
Right.
leading their army from there. Richard II and Henry VI don't. They stay in London, or in the countryside. And yeah, I mean, so how much enthusiasm do they have to carry on these wars that that everybody who perceives, both historical and at the time, perceives these war kings being far better than the other kings? I mean, it just seems to me to be to explain quite a bit about how the War of the Roses will get started, is that somebody has to take the brunt of the defeat.
Gotcha.
It should have fallen on Richard. He was the general on the spot, but you're always going to blame the king who's there, and especially when Richard, the failed general. I mean, Talbot, the other failed general, is not going to come back alive. So, Richard should have taken that on his shoulders, but he says, "I'm the king. I should have been the king,"
Right.
and then comes over and shifts the blame onto Henry. And it. I think that's one of the reasons why the Wars of the Roses takes a long time to develop. So we don't really even have a battle for a number of years.
Right.
Richard will, may move in 1452, but the war itself doesn't really get started until the Earl of Somerset is thrown into the Tower of London by Richard, and then Richard will fight and win the Battle of St. Albans.
Well,
So it takes a long time, but 5 years to get a development of a war that will become then 30 years long.
well, here's a period of history that I'm a bit fuzzy because the only thing I understand about Richard's campaigns with Henry is the Battle of St. Albans, and I know that there's also a dispute he has with the Duke of Somerset. But how exactly does Richard's campaign lead up to his confrontations
Yeah.
with Henry? What's the outcome?
Well, I mean, he doesn't really. So Henry tries to pacify Richard very early on. He recognized Henry must have recognized, or he has counselors, and this is where the Earl of Somerset comes in because he's one of his counselors. He recognizes that he's not liked, and I mean, so that's he knows that he's got to do something to bring the country of peace, and the kingdom of peace, and he does. I mean, Richard is running around claiming the throne, and so Henry does pretty much the only thing, especially after the birth of his only son, Edward. Henry does the only thing that really he thinks will make this problem less, and that is he appoints Richard to protector of the realm
Mm-hmm.
in 1454. So I think Henry is trying to find a solution
Right.
to this situation, get his hothead cousin, kind of put him down, give him responsibility. But, for Richard to actually claim to be king, Henry has to be removed, and he knows it. So he
Right.
gives him the next best thing. Okay, you can become the chief earl in the entire kingdom, as the protector of the realm. But it doesn't stop the fact that really we have two people at the top. We've got this bunch of nobles next level that are saying, who do we support in this? Do we expect that Henry VI, 10 years younger than Richard, so he's liable to live longer? Do we put our support behind Richard to overthrow him, as happened not 2 generations before, um, or do we put our support behind the king and hope that Richard could be pacified by this title and his wealth and everything else?
Right.
Uh, Out of all the conflict, it's kind of interesting because you always play what if history anyway, counterfactual. And there's so many different counterfactuals in this conflict that would be interesting. But I've always thought, what would have happened had um, had Richard de York actually been better
Right.
at anything, because he's not particularly good at waging this war either. I mean, the Battle of St. Albans does go his way, and the Earl of Somerset, the top rival he has in leadership, next to or just below Henry VI, is killed in Battle of St. Albans. So that removes one of Richard Duke of York's enemies. But afterwards, I mean, Richard after the Battle of St. Albans, Richard returns just to the protectorate of the realm.
Right.
He still keeps putting out there that he wants to be king, but he's not really. He seems it seems that even with the Battle of St. Albans thrown in there, that Henry VI may have found this solution,
Right.
except for the nobles below.
Right. Right. So if I can maybe ask,
Yeah.
what ends up happening to Richard of York? Where does he meet his demise, you might say?
Well, his demise is that he wants power. He wants power, and he's going to go up against Henry VI. So while Henry VI wants peace, and all the movements there, the appointment of Richard of York as protector, even though he's bring your enemies. What is it? Bring your enemies closer, so to speak. And then trying to reconcile the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, trying to throw things out um, to the various nobles. I mean, at this point, you got to say that Henry's doing the same, everything right and trying to make peace, but Richard's not going to be pacified. And then Richard loses the in two battles. Loses several battles, but he loses it in two battles, two major battles, very quickly. I mean, he loses it at Ledford Bridge in 1459 when the Queen is in charge of the troops on the other side. That's got to be a little bit defeating to him. And then he does respond a bit, only because of um, his son Edward, Earl of March, and Richard Neville. But in 1460, he gets trounced at the Battle of Wakefield. In many ways, the Battle of Wakefield should have ended this whole thing. And then we've got a War of Roses of 5 years long, and has a couple of major battles, three major battles, two of which are won by one side and one by the other. But the big one, Battle of Wakefield, is where Richard gets killed on the battlefield. The problem with Wakefield is that this is where Rutland is executed. So after the battle is over, the younger son of Richard, Edmund, Duke of Rutland, has been captured, and they take him to the Chantry Chapel, the bridge chapel that's still there. At least, it probably all post dates this conflict, but it's still there, and they execute him. And I think it's not just necessarily the death of Richard Duke of York that incenses Edward, the Earl of March. It's also this blatant execution of a teenage boy
Right.
who has taken no role in it, that gets Edward really, really angry. And the response is a year later, Towton, where he absolutely destroys Yorkist forces, and pretty well sweeps him away from everything. Looks like that should have been the end of the war as well. Um, and then they follow that has been preceded by a defeat at the second St. Albans, but Battle of Towton is really extensive. And in fact, there's almost nothing after that. The Yorkists, I mean, the Lancasters have been completely annihilated. There's not much leadership. So we really don't see another engagement. I mean, Henry VI is running around, but he's in exile at this point. We'll eventually get captured in 1465 when the Tower of London, uh, even Harlech Castle, which is this kind of minor thing at this point in time, uh, will surrender to Edward. So it's Edward IV after Towton who
Mhm.
really establishes a very strong kingdom. And the misfortune he has there, well, misfortune he really has there is he's still got a brother alive.
Right.
He had two for a while. Then George of Clarence is drowned, but in about a moment. But then you know because Edward, hell, I mean, there, yeah, Edgecourt more Warwick shifts sides and goes with Queen Margaret, and they win at Edgecourt Moor, which throws Edward kind of out of the kingdom for a while. I mean, and Edward the Fourth goes to Flanders, or the Burgundians, because his sister Margaret of York has married Charles the Bold of Burgundy, so he's there. But it's not long before he comes back because Henry VI doesn't prove again to be a very good king. It This is where again we got to play what if history. If Edward establishes that throne, that strength of the throne, um, and Henry VI isn't caught, doesn't create this problem, so Edward can be king, not having to go over there. Even if he then at that point still dies early, so that his sons are young, and does Richard III make the move to the kingship at that point, or is Henry VI, or is Edward the Fourth's legacy simply too strong?
Right.
Um, and
Right.
and that's an interesting question, because Edward is on the throne for a very long time. Um, One of the first things he does is he executes. This time he doesn't starve to death Henry VI. He just executes it. That's probably geez, starvation takes a little bit of time here.
Right.
And Henry VI's son has died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Battle of Tewkesbury is really the big Battle of Barnet, Battle of Tewkesbury are the two big battles that Edward will show his strength. And at that point, it seems the he has the realm in hand. And if Edward doesn't die when he does, um, and doesn't turn everything over to Richard, um, but in some way can outlast Richard,
Right.
uh, or the sons get old enough that they can take over. Then we probably don't have Henry VII coming over too.
Right. If I can maybe ask, then I know that really for at this period of time there's warring between Edward and Henry the sixth, and for even for a period of time I think like Henry the sixth is reinstated after he gets kicked off the
Yeah,
throne.
he's been staying for a few months. Yeah,
What happens to Henry the sixth? Is he executed or does he
yeah,
starve?
he's executed,
Okay.
and so he's captured at Barnet, at Battle Barnet. Earl of Warwick is killed. So
Okay.
the chief military leader and supporter of the Lancastrians at that point is killed. And then you've got Henry VI's son, killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and Henry VI captured. And at this point, they're not going to let him run around the countryside like they had done for the years after Towton.
Right.
Uh, and so he's killed.
I see.
And it depends on what Henry VI is there's two kings technically. I mean, Henry VI is, and Edward the Fourth is no doubt the king, whether he's been crowned or not. The fact that Henry VI is not going to make it out of the Tower of London is the important thing.
Right.
And So I love it, the fact that, oh no, Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London. No, Henry VI was executed. He was killed. He was irrelevant at this point
Hmm.
in time. The armies aren't supporting him. Really, in 1471, once Edward comes back, has all that support, um, that because Warwick, he may be a good general. He's a lousy diplomat with the rest of almost immediately after he forces Edward out, in 1470, he Warwick starts losing nobles to the cause almost immediately. It's like, how can you do that? You've just won. How do you now make more people want Edward to come back than to those to support the king that is there? But
Right,
Edward, so the Earl of Warwick is not a very good, not a very good peacemaker. He's pretty good. He is, maybe a kingmaker. He is maybe a war maker, but he's not a very good peacemaker. And so Edward comes back, and it's only, these two 1471 battles fought him up, in 3 weeks, the Barnet and then Tewkesbury, and it's done.
right,
That's it. So Henry's captured and he's killed now. Edward can be king. And we don't have another significant uprising until the death of Edward and the rise of Richard. And even
right,
then, Richard's okay until 1485. That's the so for 3 years he's all right. 3 years he
right,
doesn't have much. Of course, Hugh Hastings gets dragged off in the middle of the night from a parliamentary thing and gets executed in the Tower. But it's just that Richard is just a bad king.
right. Eh, Yeah, this really seems like the period of boy kings and kings that are like shut up in a tower and forgotten about. And as we're about to see, that both are the case with Edward the fifth, who he's technically
Yeah.
next in
Yeah.
line, but he's a kid, and Richard, uh, he's already kind of marshaled a lot of support at this time. I think he's already Lord Protector by the time that
Yes.
Henry dies.
Yes.
And so, yeah,
Yeah. He's been made Lord Protector um, of England in 1472. Essentially, he's made Duke of Gloucester, and then when you have when the death um, of uh, Clarence is 1478, then there's no really opposition to Richard. I honestly think that Edward could not see that Richard was going to be a problem. I think he
okay,
felt that they're kin, and
right,
he's and these brothers, including Edmund and Rutland, including Clarence, they they are not. I mean, Edward the Fourth is Edward the Fourth is such a strong king that that a couple of modern historians have tried to make him a bastard son, not Duke of York's son. He doesn't look like the others. He doesn't have the physical frailties of the others. So you get somebody like Michael Jones who says, "Well, maybe he's a, we I can put Edward, I can put Richard Duke of York somewhere else and have Edward be the daughter of an archer, because that's the man who's strong for England." I don't know. It is an interesting argument because you take the only son that's decent of this crazy father who claiming the throne, and then he has all these sons who seem to be bad except for one. Of course, we
right,
don't give Edmund Rutland much chance because he's killed when he's 14. But Clarence has a huge problem, and the fact that Richard has been moved over Clarence in Edward's in the responsibility that Edward gives him indicates probably that the rumors are true that George, Duke of Clarence, was a drunkard and all the things that they will try to make him be, and the fact that he gets this traditional murder of being drowned in a butt of Malmsey, all that stuff. which may,
Gotcha.
who knows whether it's true or not, but it's always it does make for a fun and uh, and then Richard has the. I know. believe it or not, I'm the keynote speaker at the American Society, Richard III Society next Thursday, and I have to talk about. And so I'll have to go do my obeisance to Richard III, as they all want to remove any responsibility for the death of the two princes in the towers. I mean, one of the first papers I heard 100 years ago was that the princes in the towers committed suicide
Right.
out of depression. They had committed suicide.
Hmm.
Yeah, no.
Right. If I could maybe ask, I mean, that's probably the biggest, like, infamous. I don't want to say it's regicide because they're accused of being illegitimate and they're just kind of shuffled off to the tower. But it's probably one of
Yeah.
the worst things that Richard III is accused of is killing his
Oh,
two nephews.
and it is patricide because the Parliament do whatever they want to about the legitimacy. There's no question that Edward IV wants his eldest son to be king. And if he had been older, Edward V would have just moved on to the kingship.
Right.
The fact that he is a kid, and he and the spare, the heir and the spare are sitting in the tower,
Right.
and yeah, they're just not there one day. Um, and 3 centuries later, suspiciously, some bones are found underneath the staircase
Mm,
and so forth. It's Queen Elizabeth was always very reluctant to have those bones exhumed. Now that we have Richard, Duke of York's DNA, it would be very easy to have the DNA of those bones tested to see if they are the children. Um,
interesting.
but it hilarious whenever I'll get it, of course, the American Society, but I think Josephine Tey's greatest achievement was not a mystery. It was, in fact, restoring the idea that somehow Richard III was not the murderer of the princes in her novels, and that everybody wants to believe. And even the point say, oh, well, maybe the first one didn't there. You get the Blackadder version where the second one lives and becomes Richard IV. And okay,
Right.
no, that works in Blackadder. It doesn't work otherwise. So yeah, I would, if I was a betting man, I'd bet those two bodies that are in Westminster are the children. And in that case, I mean, somebody could take a forensic archaeological look at them and see how they were killed, and probably was by strangulation, so you wouldn't see much. But
Sure.
there's no question they just don't disappear. They're just not there one day, and then you know Richard's looking around the battlefield of Bosworth saying, where are my nephews? Come on, they should be here. They should be in armor next to me fighting this battle. And what they just disappeared from the tower. Yeah, yeah. What one thinks thou doth protest too much,
Right.
uh, a bit. So I think Richard was every bit as evil as he was meant to be, and yeah, Shakespeare and Thomas More do make him out more so to legitimize the next power
Right.
broker coming in, who has no claim to the throne, really, has very little claim to the throne, and but somebody pauses. Well, maybe they were still alive in 1485 in the tower, and it's Henry that puts them to death. You say, nah, no,
Yeah.
we actually know when they stopped being seen. We don't have a lot of records on the battles. We should have better records for the Wars
Right.
and Roses on the battles, narratives on the battle. But we do actually have fairly good accounts of when the children are seen in the tower and when suddenly they're not.
Right.
So it's a little hard to remove that. And so the only other thing is it possible Richard didn't know and this was done by a henchman thinking it would. If he didn't know, he certainly didn't have large amounts of
Qualms.
grief.
Right.
Yeah, he's not seen. We don't have a scene somewhere in Shakespeare's Richard III, where he's sitting in in the chapel with crying and praying for the princes to come back.
Right, right, right. Well, you mentioned how eventually there's going to be a king who pretty much seems to come out of nowhere and seems to have
Mm-hmm.
really no claim to the throne at all. Henry Tudor, he makes a claim on the throne, and how does he make that sort of claim? Because I tried looking at my map of the
Oh
family
yeah,
tree,
genealogies, yeah.
and even I can't remember like how exactly he makes the case that
No,
he's really
as especially since he comes through a line that isn't affected by Catherine of Valois, so he can't even make the claim through the Catherine of Valois and Henry V situation. It's, I think, in many ways, the Wars of the Roses ends. I mean, it ends very dramatically, of course, with the Battle of Bosworth. And it ends even more dramatically, 500 years later when we find Richard's bones in a car park. But that ultimate battle is going to be the end of the Wars of the Roses. Although there may be a couple of engagements later that people try to move into that. It's Bosworth for sure. And Henry wins. Well, Henry Tudor. Now we're talking about Henry Tudor wins. He should have won. I mean, there's no way that this upstart who's been away from England forever in France is able to land and bring together an army and defeat the king. I mean, that shouldn't happen, right?
right.
The King of England should have the army. Well, so what has he done? What has Richard done to make people join an upstart as the solution? I mean, there's also, you've got Beaufort still running around. Beaufort's got closer claims to the throne than than Tudor does. Uh, but at that point, I think that you wonder if we're now dealing with second and third generation of nobles that have been in these wars. They've seen Warwick jump back and forth, and Percy's keep coming back in and out, and all these other nobles. It's not unusual for one noble to be executed, and his son follow the guys who executed him. And
Right.
and the Wars of the Roses is almost just a war of exhaustion. Let's get Richard gone. Let's just do it. There's nobody else. Once he's gone, because he's killed off all the other heirs. Once he's gone, he's nothing. So now, who do we follow? We'll follow Henry Tudor because why the hell not? We
Right.
just want to get this over. And he's the person of the moment. And you kind of wonder what would have happened had there been somebody on the island who wasn't Henry, who was closer, no, a bigger noble or closer to the
Right.
throne. I mean, what would have happened if he had said but they've all been involved so much in the Wars of the Roses that they've animated, the animosity between these different noble houses is huge. And so it almost takes an outsider to come in to unify.
Right.
And I think that's the story with Henry VII.
Well, how does Henry VII further cement his claims to the throne? There's of course the Battle of Bosworth Field where Richard III is defeated and killed. He is killed, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah.
and, and of course he marries who is it that he married? Elizabeth of York, who I'm trying
Yes.
to remember. She's the sister of the two princes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Of Edward.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Henry Tudor comes in and he does the right thing. I mean, he's young, unmarried. He comes in and he marries he marries himself into the last lineage in order to solidify that a bit more because they're still not we're still a century away from women being able to rule, but that would be the heir would be Elizabeth of York. That so Henry solidifies that by solidifies his relationship there so he could pacify the kingdom. He's really just legitimated his own rule by victory on the battlefield.
Okay.
But then making the entirety of England passive or peaceful at this point. He builds on this this, I think, fatigue of having had these wars fought for for 30 years. This fatigue he is able to deal with by really this very good marriage that he makes. Not the best kids he produces, but
Sure.
you figure that Arthur dies, Henry becomes the eighth, and then Margaret Tudor goes to Scotland. So
Right.
it's an interesting, their own kids. It's almost as if you get these bright shining moments of kings, and then the next generation is crap.
Right. Well,
And
no, I think that's one of the reasons why I always wondered why Henry was so desperate. Henry VIII was so desperate for an heir that he like seceded from the Church of England. But it makes total sense given the background of a very
yeah,
bloody War of the Roses looming
yeah.
over his family tree.
I mean, Elizabeth does the only thing she knows, which is don't produce children. I mean, she's the product of a man who lopped off her mother's head for having her. That's kind of the definition of dysfunctional family. And no wonder she doesn't want to have. And Mary goes through everything. I mean, she thinks she's pregnant 18 months and
Right.
in a stretch, when it's likely Philip II never even had intercourse with her. So it's Kings of England really boggle the mind, as to how they stay where they are. I mean, it's good there is no divine right, because they get thrown out every once in a while. In France, they've got to have that problem where if you overthrow a king, you've got to have a Charles VI in his rubber throne room, because you can't overthrow him. He's divine right by divine right king. But
Right.
I think if you look at the Wars of Roses kind of being the first time there's going to be peace for a long time, and yeah, there are a couple of tiny engagements they have afterwards in 1487, for example. Um, but this is a country that has fought in wars like since we have to go all the way back to Edward II and the wars against Robert Bruce. It's almost been continual from then to to the Wars of the Roses.
Right.
So, there's generations that have been born of nobles and that have been born that they're not going to know anything but war and violent death. If you take the Clifford line, not only do you have Clifford that's captured at Boroughbridge and hanging outside the walls of the castle that gets his name, but if you look at that family tree, and it's fun just going up to Skipton and looking at the church and looking in the line, they lost a nobleman in every significant battle, including at Towton, and including one at Ashigore. I mean, how many nobles were lost at Ashigore? But one of them was Clifford. There is 2 centuries of Cliffords, and it's interesting because the family's still around. I've talked to Duke Clifford, or whatever his title is now, and because he's very interested, of course, in the family. And I just said, if I knew Clifford was on the battlefield, I'd stay away, because he's going to be obviously the target. And there's so many that die. One of course, Clifford of Bannockburn as well, and so they really begin in with those conflicts, and then they all the way through. They've got no. So that means a whole line of nobles for 2 centuries have died violently in battle,
Right.
and that's duplicated over and over and over among these noble families for 2 centuries. So the fatigue in 1485 has got to be significant, and they're probably looking, for anybody, is there, just rise out of the sea and we'll make you king, and that's what Henry VII does. And then he sets out to really try to make peace, only then to have Henry VIII not do so with everybody asunder.
Right.
Uh, but it's an interesting period, but I don't think it can be taken separately. So many people want to take the Wars of the Roses unique as a unique war, but it's far from unique. It's it is the extension of all these other wars that have been going on in the 14th, 15th century that England's been involved in. And as there are civil wars going on elsewhere in France and the Holy Roman Empire and Italy, all over the place, in Italy, Spain, this is unusual for the end of the 15th century. But it really, that whole Europe in the later Middle Ages is just one huge bloody fight from Ottomans all the way across to Spain, and even in Scandinavia. So all the way from Scandinavia into the Mediterranean, just warfare for 2 centuries. So the Wars of the Roses is fun, it's unique, but at the same time, it really doesn't hold a lot of significance outside of England.
Right. Well, Dr. DeVries, if I can maybe give a closing question, do you have any book recommendations you'd have for those who want to learn more about the War of the Roses or the Hundred Years' War, or even like
Well,
medieval warfare in general?
yeah, I mean the Hundred Years' War. I still think there's Edward Troy has the best single volume of that. But Sumption's major works, while I have lots of criticism over this big major works, they're accomplishing in putting out a really strong history of the Hundred Years' War. Wars of the Roses have got more books written on it than the Hundred Years' War does. It's really surprising. David Grummett, I like David Grummett's book on a single volume on the wars. I like John Gillingham, still reads very well. And for him to, I asked John at one point, why did you leave the Wars of the Roses, go back to the 12th century? He says, it really is a lot nicer to be in the 12th century. It's just so complicated, the Wars of the Roses. But Anthony Goodman has two books that really focus on the military history. The first one that focuses on military history, I think, is the best. And then the one about the soldier in the Wars of the Roses, that's a very interesting one too. So there's good ones. I Some of the Wars of the Roses books, unfortunately, think are written as almost as if warfare is not occurring,
Right.
which is really strange.
Yeah.
And I have to go off on Thursday. Or Friday. I'm giving a paper on presentation on gunpowder weapons because I've changed some of my thoughts about gunpowder weapons. David Grummett and Dan Spencer have helped me change some of my thoughts there. Comparatively, still not as good as what's happening on continent or in the Middle East, but or in the Eastern Mediterranean. But they're more prominent than I had initially speculated in the Wars of Roses. But so those are where I would stand. So many books of the Wars of Roses that you can read, of course. Books on Edward IV. Is the Yale biography on Edward IV is still really outstanding. So it's fun, and it's not going to end.
Right.
There's too many questions still there. It's not going to end. So it'll be like the American Civil War in that regard, or the English Civil War. There's going to be new books produced every day, or at least every month on the Wars of the Roses.
Well, Dr. DeVries, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, not a problem. I'm sorry I kind of droned on there a little bit, but it is a complicated series of wars, both getting to it and finishing it.